They called her the Apache servant so often that most folks had forgotten she even had a name. But there are moments in the Old West when the quietest soul in the room is carrying the heaviest secret, and the truth always has a way of arriving on horseback. Dust drifted lazily through the single street of Ash Hollow as the late afternoon sun painted every weathered storefront in deep amber. Horses stood tied outside the saloon, tails flicking at flies, while the scent of leather, fresh hay, and coffee floated through the warm air. It looked like any other frontier town, the kind travelers passed without remembering, where every face seemed familiar and every stranger became the subject of whispered conversation before sunset. Inside the Silver Lantern Saloon, boots scraped across old pine floors, glasses clinked softly, and laughter rolled beneath the slow rhythm of a tired piano. Moving quietly between the tables was a young Apache woman carrying a tray with steady hands. No one thanked her. No one looked directly into her eyes. To the ranch hands, she was simply the servant. To the merchants, she was that Indian girl. Even the owner rarely called her anything except, "Girl, over here." She answered every request with the same calm nod, never raising her voice, never arguing, never showing anger. Her name was Naya, though very few people in Ash Hollow seemed interested in learning it. Ethan Walker noticed because he always noticed the things other people ignored. He had driven cattle across 3 territories, slept beneath more stars than he could count, and learned long ago that silence often revealed more than conversation. The first time he stepped into the Silver Lantern after delivering a herd nearly 60 miles south, he expected another ordinary evening. Instead, his attention settled on the Apache woman polishing a row of dusty glasses beneath the front window. She moved with unusual precision, every motion measured, almost graceful, as though even the smallest task deserved respect. It wasn't the work that caught Ethan's attention. It was her posture. She stood perfectly straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never truly belonged beneath another person's orders. Most servants lowered their gaze whenever customers looked their way. Naya didn't. She simply met each glance without challenge, then returned to her work as if opinions carried no weight at all. One of the ranch hands laughed as he tossed a dirty towel onto the counter. "You're lucky the boss took you in," he muttered without looking at her. "Otherwise you'd still be wandering the desert." The room chuckled politely before returning to their drinks. Naya picked up the towel without saying a single word. Ethan expected hurt to cross her face. Instead, she folded the cloth carefully, placed it beside the others, and continued wiping the counter. There was no bitterness, no humiliation, only patience. That puzzled him more than any argument could have. As she reached for another glass, the sleeve of her faded work dress slipped back just enough to reveal the inside of her wrist. Ethan's breath slowed. Burned into the leather bracelet she wore was the shape of an eagle unlike any cattle brand or military insignia he had ever seen. It wasn't decorative. It looked ceremonial, old enough for the edges to soften with time, yet preserved with remarkable care. Before he could study it further, Naya gently pulled her sleeve back into place. For only a heartbeat, her eyes met his across the crowded saloon. They were calm, unreadable, and strangely familiar, as though she recognized something about him long before he realized there was anything unusual about her. The next morning arrived with a pale gold sunrise that stretched across the valley, washing Ash Hollow in the quiet promise of another ordinary day. Wagons creaked over the hard-packed road, merchants swept yesterday's dust from their porches, and somewhere beyond the barns a rooster announced the dawn as though the frontier depended upon his voice alone. Ethan Walker tied his bay gelding outside the general store before crossing toward the Silver Lantern, drawn less by hunger than by a question he could not explain. Something about the Apache woman refused to leave his thoughts. He had spent years reading weather, cattle, and men, because survival often depended on noticing what others overlooked. The same instinct now urged him toward answers. Inside the saloon, Naya was already working. She arranged chairs with quiet efficiency, wiped the windows until the morning light poured through spotless glass, and carried fresh coffee to the kitchen without spilling a single drop. Every movement seemed practiced, almost ceremonial, as though discipline had become part of her breathing. Mrs. Harper, the owner of the establishment, barely looked up as she handed Naya another stack of dishes. "Make certain everything is ready before the noon crowd," she said sharply. Naya answered with a simple, "Yes, ma'am," her voice calm and steady. Ethan noticed something unusual. There was no trace of resentment, yet there was no submission either. She obeyed, but she never appeared diminished. The distinction was subtle enough that no one else seemed to recognize it. A pair of traveling salesmen settled near the window, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Strange that she speaks English so well," one remarked with a chuckle. The other shrugged. "A servant learns whatever her employer teaches." Naya continued polishing silverware as though the conversation belonged to someone else entirely. Ethan watched her reflection in the polished tray. Not once did her hands hesitate. Not once did her expression change. It was the kind of composure he had seen only in seasoned trail bosses who remained steady during storms because panic never solved a problem. As the morning passed, the town banker entered carrying several rolled maps beneath his arm. One slipped free and scattered across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Naya stepped forward, catching the largest sheet before it slid beneath a muddy boot. She knelt carefully and spread the map across a nearby table. Ethan expected her to stare at it without understanding, but instead her eyes moved across the faded lines with quiet familiarity. She turned the page exactly 90 degrees, smoothing one corner before pointing to a faint creek marked near the northern ridge. "This route floods after spring rain," she said softly. "The western trail stays dry. Longer." The banker blinked in surprise before quickly rolling the map closed. "You can read these?" he asked. Naya paused only a moment. "A little." She lowered her eyes and stepped away as if she had revealed too much. The conversation drifted on, yet Ethan remained frozen where he stood. That was not luck. That was knowledge earned through experience. Later, while carrying firewood behind the building, Ethan noticed fresh hoofprints pressed into the soft dirt beside the stable. They were clean, deliberate, and stopped beside the rear entrance where Naya often disappeared between chores. Resting near the wall was a saddle unlike any he had seen in town. The leather was worn but beautifully maintained, decorated with careful beadwork and the same eagle symbol he had glimpsed on her bracelet. It was not the saddle of a servant earning pennies in a frontier saloon. It belonged to someone who had once ridden with purpose across open country. Before Ethan could study it further, the stable door opened quietly. Naya stepped outside carrying a bucket of water. She noticed where his eyes had settled, then calmly covered the saddle with an old canvas cloth. For the first time, a faint smile crossed her face. It was not nervous. It was knowing, as though she understood the questions growing inside him and accepted that the answers would eventually find their own way into the light. The following afternoon the wind shifted from the west, carrying the dry scent of sage across Ash Hollow as dark clouds gathered beyond the distant hills. Folks hurried to finish their errands before the weather turned, and the streets filled with the steady rhythm of wagon wheels and horseshoes striking packed earth. Ethan Walker had planned to leave town before sunset, but something kept him lingering near the silver lantern. He told himself it was another cup of coffee, although he knew better. Questions had a way of tying stronger knots than ropes, and every quiet glance from Naya only tightened them. The first sign that she was not the woman everyone believed arrived without warning. A frightened stable boy burst through the saloon doors, breathing hard enough to steal the attention of every customer. "Smoke," he shouted. "The feed barn behind the mill is filling with smoke." Chairs scraped across the wooden floor as men rushed outside, voices colliding in confusion. Some ran toward the wrong building while others argued about fetching water before anyone had even seen the source. Ethan followed the crowd, arriving to find gray smoke drifting through the roof vents of the old storage barn where sacks of grain and winter hay were stacked nearly to the rafters. The air smelled of scorched timber, but panic spread faster than the smoke itself. Ranch hands shouted different orders all at once. Buckets appeared from every direction. Horses stamped nervously inside nearby corrals. In the middle of the confusion, Ethan noticed someone moving without haste. Naya stepped into the yard carrying nothing except quiet certainty. She did not raise her voice. She simply pointed toward the windmill. "Use the water from the east trough first," she said. "Do not open both barn doors. The wind will carry more smoke inside." A few men ignored her immediately. One laughed. Since when does the servant tell ranchers how to save a barn? Another reached for the front door anyway, but Ethan caught his arm. He could not explain why, only that every instinct told him to listen. Together they followed her instructions instead. Water came from the eastern trough, while the western entrance stayed closed against the rising breeze. Within minutes the smoke began to thin. An old lantern, left burning beside damp straw, had filled the building with smoke without spreading beyond a small corner. The danger passed almost as quickly as it had begun. Mrs. Harper folded her arms with relief. Good thing the boys acted fast, she declared proudly. Several townsmen nodded toward Ethan, clapping him on the shoulder as though he alone had solved the problem. He accepted none of the praise. His eyes remained fixed on Naya, who had quietly returned the empty buckets to their places before anyone thought to thank her. She slipped back toward the kitchen as though saving the day had simply been another chore on her list. Later that evening, Ethan found her standing alone behind the saloon, watching the fading sunlight stretch across the prairie. "How did you know which door to keep closed?" he asked gently. Naya rested one hand on the old fence rail without turning around. "Smoke follows the wind," she answered. "People often make danger worse because they hurry before they think." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds like something somebody taught you." She looked toward the distant mountains glowing beneath the setting sun. Sometimes the land teaches better than people do. Before he could ask another question, the distant sound of hoofbeats drifted across the valley. Only 3 riders appeared along the northern ridge, too far away for anyone in town to notice. Naya noticed immediately. Her calm expression changed for the first time since Ethan had met her. It was not fear. It was recognition. She watched the riders until they disappeared beyond a stand of cottonwoods, then quietly whispered for words almost too soft for the evening breeze to carry. They found the valley already. That night the wind settled into a slow whisper through the cottonwoods, carrying the smell of rain that never quite arrived. Ash Hollow drifted toward sleep, one lantern at a time, but Ethan Walker remained awake on the narrow porch outside the boarding house, replaying every strange moment since he had met Naya. The eagle carved into her bracelet, the forgotten saddle hidden beneath worn canvas, the way she had read the map without hesitation, the calm authority she carried when everyone else lost theirs. None of it belonged to the life of a servant. Long after the last piano note faded from the silver lantern, a faint knock echoed against the back door of the saloon. Ethan noticed because silence had sharpened his hearing over years spent on lonely cattle drives. He stepped quietly into the shadows beside the stable and watched without meaning to spy. Naya opened the rear door only a few inches. An elderly rider stood outside wrapped in a weathered brown blanket. His horse looked exhausted from a long journey, its coat dusted white from miles of dry trails. The old man removed his hat, but did not step inside. Instead, he reached beneath his coat and offered a small leather pouch sealed with dark blue thread. Naya accepted it with both hands, lowering her head in quiet respect. No words passed between them at first. The rider simply touched 2 fingers over his heart before returning to the saddle. Moments later, he disappeared into the darkness as quietly as he had arrived. Ethan waited until the sound of hoofbeats vanished beyond the creek. Through the narrow crack of the kitchen window, he saw Naya untie the blue thread with remarkable care. Inside rested a folded letter and a thin silver medallion that reflected the lantern light like a tiny moon. She unfolded the paper slowly. Her calm expression remained unchanged at first, but after only a few lines her shoulders became perfectly still. It was the stillness of someone absorbing difficult news rather than unexpected news. Whatever the message contained, she had been preparing for it long before tonight. She closed her eyes briefly, then placed the letter into the small cast iron stove. The edges curled almost immediately as the flames consumed every word. Only the silver medallion remained. She held it in her palm for several seconds before slipping it beneath the same leather bracelet that covered the eagle's symbol on her wrist. Ethan strained to see the face of the medallion before she hid it beneath her sleeve. He caught only the outline of a mountain surrounded by tiny stars pressed into polished silver. The design stirred something distant in his memory. Years earlier, while delivering cattle near Fort Stanton, he had overheard 2 Army officers speaking about a sacred Apache emblem connected to tribal leadership. He had not paid attention then. Now the memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Before he could gather his thoughts, the kitchen door opened. Naya stepped into the cool night, carrying the empty leather pouch. She walked toward the edge of town where an old cottonwood overlooked the creek. Ethan stayed back, careful not to reveal himself. Beneath the great tree, she knelt beside a flat stone and buried the pouch beneath loose earth with deliberate movements. There was nothing hurried about the ritual. It felt practiced, meaningful, almost sacred. Rising slowly, she looked toward the northern mountains where the three riders had appeared the evening before. Moonlight caught her face as she whispered words carried away by the breeze before Ethan could fully hear them. Only the final sentence reached him clearly. There is still time if they arrive before the harvest. As she turned to leave, the silver medallion slipped briefly from beneath her sleeve, glimmering against the pale moonlight before disappearing once again. Ethan remained beneath the shadows long after she returned inside, realizing that whatever secret Naya protected had grown far larger than one woman, one saloon, or even one forgotten frontier town. Morning broke beneath a blanket of low gray clouds, leaving the streets of Ash Hollow strangely quiet. Even the usual laughter drifting from the feed store sounded subdued, as though the town itself sensed something waiting just beyond the horizon. Ethan Walker saddled his horse before sunrise, hoping a ride through the surrounding hills might clear his thoughts, but every trail seemed to lead him back toward the questions surrounding Naya. By the time he returned, a crowd had already gathered outside the sheriff's office. Wagons stood abandoned in the street, horses shifted impatiently against their reins, and worried voices blended into one uneasy murmur. Sheriff Amos Briggs stepped onto the wooden porch holding a folded piece of paper in one hand. His weathered face looked more troubled than stern. A freight wagon carrying payroll for the railroad camp never arrived yesterday, he announced. The driver turned up this morning without the strongbox. He claims he saw riders wearing Apache clothing near Red Cedar Pass. A ripple of uneasy whispers swept through the crowd. No one knew whether the story was true, yet certainty spread faster than facts ever could. One merchant crossed his arms and shook his head. There has not been an Apache camp anywhere near here for months. Another answered immediately. Then somebody has been hiding them. The conversation shifted almost without effort, drifting from missing money to old fears buried beneath years of uneasy peace. Ethan noticed familiar glances beginning to settle toward the silver lantern. Before long, one ranch hand spoke aloud what others had only whispered. That Apache girl came from somewhere. None of us really knows where. Another man nodded. She reads maps better than most surveyors. She keeps secrets. Maybe she has been sending information all along. The accusations carried no proof, only suspicion, yet each sentence made the next easier to believe. Ethan stepped forward. Knowing how to read does not make someone guilty. A few heads turned toward him before looking away again. Fear rarely listened to reason once it found a comfortable place to settle. Mrs. Harper emerged from the saloon with flowers still dusting her apron. She looked from the sheriff to the growing crowd before calling for Naya. Moments later, Naya walked calmly onto the boardwalk, wiping her hands on a clean kitchen towel. She looked at the gathering without surprise, almost as though she had expected this morning to arrive. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat. Nobody is accusing you of anything yet, he said carefully. But folks have questions. Naya answered with quiet respect. Then they should ask them. Instead of asking, the townspeople offered assumptions. They spoke about her language, her bracelet, the visitors who sometimes arrived after dark, and the saddle hidden behind the stable. Each ordinary detail became suspicious once fear stitched them together. Ethan watched her face closely, expecting frustration or anger. Neither appeared. She simply listened with the same calm expression she had worn while washing dishes and sweeping floors. When the voices finally faded, she spoke only one sentence. Truth does not become smaller because doubt grows louder. The words settled across the street like the first drop before a storm. No one answered immediately. Sheriff Briggs rubbed the brim of his hat, uncertain what to do next. Before he could speak again, a young messenger came galloping into town from the northern trail. His horse stopped in a spray of dust as he caught his breath. Riders, he called. A large group coming from the mountains. They are less than 5 miles away. Every conversation ended. At once, people turned instinctively toward the northern ridge where the distant hills met the wide morning sky. Ethan looked at Naya. She did not appear frightened. She simply lifted her eyes toward the mountains with the quiet expression of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment far longer than anyone else in Ash Hollow could possibly imagine. No one in Ash Hollow remembered a morning when silence felt so loud. The usual sounds of hammers, wagon wheels, and friendly greetings disappeared beneath a single growing rhythm that drifted from the northern hills. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, deliberate. Every person on the main street turned toward the ridge where a thin cloud of pale dust rose against the blue horizon. Sheriff Amos Briggs rested one hand on the porch rail, squinting into the distance. Beside him, merchants shaded their eyes while ranch hands instinctively stepped away from the middle of the road. Ethan Walker counted the riders as they gradually emerged from the morning haze. 10 became 20. 20 became 40. More followed until well over 100 horsemen stretched across the hillside in quiet formation. They did not gallop. They did not raise their voices. They rode with calm discipline, their horses moving at the same measured pace as though every step had been agreed upon long before sunrise. Bright blankets rested across the saddles, polished bridles reflected the sunlight, and eagle feathers stirred gently in the breeze above several riders. Ethan noticed something even stranger. No rifles rested in their hands. No one pointed a weapon. Their hands remained visible, relaxed upon the reins. The sight confused everyone. Fear expected anger. Instead, it found dignity. As the riders reached the edge of town, the leader lifted one hand. Instantly, the entire column stopped. Not a single horse moved another step. Dust slowly settled around them until the valley became almost perfectly still. The only sound came from the wind brushing across the dry grass. The elderly rider at the front dismounted first. His long gray hair rested neatly across his shoulders, and a carved walking staff hung beside his saddle. One by one the other riders also stepped onto the ground. None crossed into the street. They waited in respectful silence as though standing before a place they considered sacred. Sheriff Briggs swallowed carefully before walking forward. "State your business," he called, doing his best to keep his voice steady. The old rider placed his right hand over his heart before speaking in calm, deliberate English. "We have not come for land. We have not come for payment. We have not come for conflict." His eyes slowly swept across the gathered townspeople before stopping somewhere behind them. "We have come for one woman." A restless murmur spread through Ash Hollow. Several people immediately turned toward the silver lantern. Mrs. Harper instinctively stepped in front of the doorway while Ethan quietly moved beside her. Naya stood just inside the entrance, her face peaceful, her hands folded before her apron exactly as they had been every morning for months. The old rider took 3 slow steps forward before stopping once again. He lowered his eyes respectfully. "We seek Naya." No title followed her name. No explanation. Only quiet certainty. Ethan glanced toward Naya, expecting surprise. But she simply closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again with the calm acceptance of someone greeting a day that had finally arrived. She removed her work apron with careful hands and folded it neatly across the counter. Mrs. Harper stared at her in disbelief. "You knew they were coming?" Naya answered gently. "I hoped they would arrive before fear reached this town." Without another word, she walked through the saloon doors into the bright morning sunlight. The 100 riders remained perfectly still. As she stepped onto the dusty street, the old rider slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Then the man beside him did the same. Across the entire line, every Apache rider followed together until more than 100 people knelt in complete silence before the woman whom Ash Hollow had known only as the servant. No one in town spoke. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt the truth that had finally begun to reveal itself. No one dared to move. More than 100 Apache riders remained on one knee beneath the morning sun, their heads bowed before the woman who had spent months carrying trays, sweeping floors, and serving coffee to people who had never once asked about her past. The silence felt heavier than thunder. Ethan Walker watched Naya take one slow step forward until she stood before the elderly rider. She reached down with both hands and gently invited him to rise. "Please," she said softly. "You honor me too greatly." The old man smiled with tired eyes that carried decades of memory. "No honor could ever equal what belongs to you." From a leather case hanging beside his saddle, he carefully removed a polished wooden staff carved with soaring eagles, mountain ridges, and flowing rivers. At its top rested a circle of silver surrounding the same emblem Ethan had seen hidden beneath Naya's sleeve. The old man held the staff across both palms before lowering his head once more. "Our chief," he said quietly, "your people have waited 5 long years for you to come home." A gasp swept through the townspeople. Mrs. Harper covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Sheriff Amos Briggs slowly removed his hat. The ranch hands who had laughed at Naya only hours earlier stared without speaking. Ethan felt the scattered pieces of every strange moment finally begin to fit together. The bracelet, the saddle, the maps, the letter burned in the stove, the riders who had appeared on distant hills. None of it had been random. None of it belonged to a servant. Naya accepted the carved staff with visible hesitation, almost as though its weight carried more responsibility than comfort. She ran her fingertips across the familiar carvings before looking toward the mountains beyond Ash Hollow. "I did not leave because I wished to abandon my people," she said, her calm voice reaching every corner of the silent street. "I left because too many lives depended upon one person disappearing." The old rider nodded slowly. "After your father passed beyond this world, many believed anyone carrying his blood would become a target for those who wanted power instead of peace. The council chose to hide you where no one would think to search. Who would ever imagine that the daughter of a great Apache leader would spend her days washing dishes inside a frontier saloon?" A few quiet smiles appeared among the kneeling riders, not from amusement, but from relief. Ethan realized that the greatest disguise had not been clothing or distance. It had been humility. Naya had hidden in plain sight because pride would have betrayed her long ago. She turned toward Mrs. Harper, whose eyes filled with regret. "You gave me honest work when no one else would," Naya said warmly. "You never asked where I came from, only whether I was willing to work hard." Mrs. Harper shook her head slowly. "I thought I was helping a lonely girl survive." Naya smiled with gentle kindness. "You were." Then she looked toward Ethan. Their eyes met across the dusty street exactly as they had inside the saloon on the day they first met. "And you," she said quietly, "were the first person who looked beyond what everyone else had already decided." Ethan searched for words, but found none worthy of the moment. He simply removed his hat as a sign of respect. The old rider stepped beside Naya and spoke once more, his voice carrying both pride and gratitude. "Her true name is Chief Naya Red Sky, keeper of the River Treaty, guardian of the Eagle Council, and daughter of Chief Takota Red Sky, whose final wish was that peace would outlive his own lifetime." As those words settled over Ash Hollow, every assumption the town had carried for months disappeared like dust carried away by a prairie wind, leaving only one undeniable truth behind. The woman they believed had possessed the least authority among them had quietly carried the greatest responsibility of them all. Naya stood quietly with the carved staff resting in her hands while every eye in Ash Hollow remained fixed upon her. The morning breeze stirred the fringe along her sleeves, carrying the scent of sage across the silent street. More than 100 Apache riders waited without speaking. They had crossed valleys and mountains to bring their chief home, yet none of them hurried her decision. Ethan Walker realized that true authority did not demand obedience. It inspired patience. Sheriff Amos Briggs finally stepped forward, removing his hat once more. His voice carried the weight of honest regret. "Chief Naya," he said carefully, "if our town has wronged you, then I ask forgiveness on behalf of every person standing here." Before anyone else could speak, one of the ranch hands lowered his eyes. He was the same man who had mocked her only days before. "I called you names because I thought I knew who you were," he admitted quietly. Another merchant followed. Then another. One by one, the people who had judged her offered apologies without excuses. No one defended their assumptions anymore, because the truth had become impossible to ignore. Naya listened to every word with the same calm expression she had worn while washing dishes behind the saloon counter. When the voices finally faded, she looked slowly across the gathered faces. "There is nothing unusual about making a mistake," she said gently. "The danger begins when people refuse to see beyond it." Her words settled over the town without accusation. They sounded more like an invitation than a lesson. The elderly Apache rider stepped beside her once again. "Our council is ready," he said. "Many families wait beyond the eastern ridge. They believe you will return with us today and reclaim your place." Naya lowered her eyes to the carved staff before lifting them toward Ash Hollow. She saw the weathered church, the feed store, the stable where she had hidden the old saddle, and the worn wooden porch of the Silver Lantern where Mrs. Harper still stood with tears shining in her eyes. This little frontier town had never known her true name, yet it had unknowingly given her something equally valuable. Time, safety, a chance for peace to survive while anger surged in the wrong places. She turned toward the Apache riders. If I leave today without finishing what my father hoped for, then hiding all these years would have meant very little. Quiet curiosity spread through both groups. Naya walked to the center of the street where everyone could hear her clearly. The river treaty was never meant to belong to one tribe or one town. It belongs to every child who deserves to grow up without fearing the people living across. The next hill. She looked first toward Sheriff Briggs, then toward the council elder. I asked both sides to meet beneath the cottonwood by the creek before sunset. Not as enemies, not as strangers, as neighbors willing to listen. The old rider smiled with unmistakable pride. You speak exactly as your father once did. Ethan watched the faces around him soften in ways he had never imagined possible. The missing payroll that had filled the town with suspicion was quietly resolved when another messenger arrived from Red Cedar Pass, carrying news that the wagon had been delayed by a washed-out crossing and would arrive safely before evening. The rumors that had nearly condemned an innocent woman dissolved as quickly as they had appeared. Fear had built the story. Truth had ended it. Naya turned toward Ethan before returning to the waiting riders. You once asked how I knew which barn door should stay closed, she said with a faint smile. Sometimes the smallest opening allows a dangerous wind inside. Ethan nodded as he finally understood she had never been speaking only about smoke. She had been speaking about prejudice, fear, and the quiet choices that decide whether a community loses itself or finds the courage to become something better. The meeting beneath the old cottonwood lasted until the last colors of sunset faded behind the western hills. No voices were raised. No hands reached for weapons. Ranchers, merchants, Apache elders, and townspeople stood together in a wide circle while the creek flowed quietly beside them, as though the land itself had been waiting for this conversation long before any of them were born. Chief Naya Red Sky spoke little, allowing others to tell their stories first. Families shared memories of difficult winters, failed harvests, lost opportunities, and years spent fearing neighbors they had never truly known. As darkness settled across the valley, Sheriff Amos Briggs placed his signature beside the mark of the Apache Council upon a fresh copy of the River Treaty, restoring the agreement that many believed had been forgotten forever. When the final lanterns were extinguished, Ash Hollow felt strangely different. Not because every problem had disappeared overnight, but because the town had finally learned that understanding always begins with listening. Several months passed, and autumn painted the cottonwoods in shades of gold that shimmered against the clear western sky. Travelers arriving in Ash Hollow noticed small changes before anyone bothered explaining them. The Silver Lantern still served strong coffee before sunrise. Horses still crowded the hitching posts every Saturday. Children still chased one another across the dusty street. Yet there was something gentler in the air. Apache traders now entered town openly, welcomed with handshakes instead of suspicious glances. Ranchers exchanged grain for woven blankets and handcrafted tools. The old fear that had once lived between both communities slowly gave way to familiar greetings and shared laughter carried by the prairie wind. Mrs. Harper kept one special place behind the saloon counter exactly as Naya had left it. Her neatly folded apron remained hanging on its wooden hook, untouched except for the occasional dusting. Whenever curious visitors asked about it, Mrs. Harper simply smiled and said, "It belongs to someone who taught this town how little we truly see when we only look with our eyes." Ethan Walker stayed in Ash Hollow longer than he had planned. Every few weeks he rode north along the creek, carrying supplies requested by families living beyond the mountains, and every journey reminded him how different the world appeared once people stopped measuring one another by appearances alone. On one crisp October morning, he returned to town carrying a small cedar box carefully wrapped in soft leather. Inside rested the faded kitchen towel Naya had folded on her final morning at the Silver Lantern, washed clean but still carrying a faint scent of cedar smoke and fresh coffee. Ethan walked to the cottonwood beside the creek where the renewed treaty had been signed. Beneath its wide branches stood a simple stone placed there by both communities together. There were no grand speeches when it was raised. No celebration. Only quiet gratitude. Ethan opened the cedar box, folded the old towel once more, and placed it gently beside the stone before removing his hat. The inscription carved into the weathered granite contained only a few words. It did not call her a servant. It did not mention her title. It did not speak about hidden royalty or forgotten bloodlines. It simply read, Naya Red Sky. She chose peace when she could have chosen pride. Ethan stood there for a long moment, listening to the creek, the distant horses, and the wind passing through golden leaves overhead. He finally understood why Naya had never corrected the people who underestimated her. The strongest people do not spend their lives proving who they are. They simply live with such quiet dignity that, sooner or later, the truth speaks for them. Out on the frontier, where dust could hide a traveler and silence often carried more weight than words, the greatest measure of a person was never the clothes they wore, the work they performed, or the name others called them. It was the kindness they carried when no one believed they had any reason to give it.